Ehud concealed a sword on his right thigh to teach that bold obedience in God's timing can shatter the mightiest oppressors. He secured a private audience with the Moabite king, showing that faith-filled strategy honors God's subtle guidance. Ehud stood before the king under golden light to illustrate that courage begins the moment you step forward in obedience. He drew the slender sword from his robe to remind us that unexpected preparation can turn the tide of history. The blade sank into the king's hidden flesh to prove that a single decisive act of faith can break the chains of oppression. Court officials assumed the king was at ease, demonstrating that misplaced assumptions leave the door open for divine deliverance. Ehud slipped away through the cool latrine corridor, illustrating that resourceful escapes often follow quiet faith. He sounded the trumpet at Mount Sarah to highlight that timely warnings rally hearts to God's cause. Israel gathered at his call to reveal that united obedience empowers communities to overcome giants. They routed the Moabite forces to remind that one act of faith can ignite a nation's freedom. Shamgar saw the Philistines pressing hard on Israel to show that adversity calls for bold courage. Shamgar grabbed an ordinary ox-goad to teach that even the simplest tool, when wielded by a willing heart, becomes an instrument of breakthrough. Shamgar faced the Philistine soldiers head-on, revealing that faith makes us fearless in the face of giants. Shamgar swung the ox-goad with unwavering resolve, showing how determination can turn an unlikely weapon into a symbol of hope. Shamgar struck down enemy soldiers one by one to teach that each small act of obedience can topple overwhelming odds. Shamgar's hand felled 600 foes, revealing that God can multiply our efforts for mighty victory. Shamgar's daring stand halted the enemy's advance, showing that a single act of faith can shift the tide of battle. Word of Shamgar's triumph spread across Israel to teach that brave actions inspire a nation to rise. A season of peace followed Shamgar's courageous deed, revealing that obedience brings lasting freedom. Shamgar trusted God's strength over human might, showing how trusting in the divine turns weakness into triumph. Deborah summoned Barak to show that leadership anchored in faith summons strength beyond ourselves. Barak gathered Israelite troops at Mount Tabor to teach that united obedience stands firmly against formidable challenges. The Israelite army faced chariots and horsemen to show that courage against superior forces defies human limitations. Deborah proclaimed God's guidance to teach that divine strategy brings victory where human tactics fall short. The troops advanced with trumpets and banners to show that bold action inspired by faith rallies hearts to triumph. God sent a sudden rainstorm to teach that unexpected intervention can turn the tide without human effort. The chariots sank into floodwaters, showing that apparent strength can falter when divine timing is at work. Jael welcomed Sisera into her tent to teach that unexpected allies emerge when hearts are open to courage. Deborah sang a victory song to show that gratitude and praise amplify the legacy of deliverance. Israel rejoiced in unity to teach that faith-filled teamwork yields unstoppable breakthrough. Gideon hid in the winepress to thresh wheat, to show that God equips us in the silence for our destiny. An angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon to teach that God's call reaches us even in doubt. Gideon reduced his army to 300 men, to demonstrate that obedience often means trusting beyond the odds. They broke jars and held lamps in their hands, to show that even fragile tools can shine in God's plan. They sounded trumpets at midnight, to remind us that bold worship can shake the strongest strongholds. Israel's army surrounded the Midianite camp unseen, to teach that stealthy faith can outmaneuver overwhelming forces. All at once, the lamps went bright before the enemy, to illustrate that sudden revelation can disorient the darkness. The men blew the trumpets and shouted, "A sword for the Lord," to prove that unified voices carry divine authority. Midianites fled in panic into the Jordan, showing that fear surrendered to God's power leads to victory. Gideon and his men stood triumphant at dawn, to reveal that faithful obedience brings lasting deliverance. Before his birth, an angel declared that Samson would live under a Nazirite vow to teach that God's purpose often begins long before our first breath. Samson wrestled a young lion with his bare hands to demonstrate that unwavering faith can conquer even the most ferocious challenges. Samson snapped ropes like they were threads to show that limitations imposed by others cannot bind a heart fueled by divine strength. Samson pushed open the city gate pillars, showing that true strength often stands alone against seemingly immovable barriers. Samson wielded a simple jawbone against enemy soldiers to remind us that God's power transforms humble tools into instruments of victory. Samson stood blind and humbled in chains, demonstrating that our greatest failures can lead to the deepest dependence on divine mercy. Samson's hair grew back unnoticed in captivity, showing that even when hope seems hidden, God's promise quietly prepares a comeback. Samson leaned against temple pillars in prayer, revealing that surrendering our strength to God can set the stage for his greatest acts. Samson pulled down the temple pillars with all his might to illustrate that selfless sacrifice can topple the strongest strongholds. Samson gave his life to topple the oppressor, marking that even flawed vessels fulfill God's grand purposes through complete surrender.